I'm Rachel Hammer Russell, editor-in-chief of Residence 11, a website and community that celebrates sensuality, romance, intimacy, and loving in a new age of human connection. In advance of our first live event happening February 11th, the Residence 11 Desire Summit on Sex and Relationships, which will be held in Los Angeles and also live streamed, we're speaking with Desire Summit speaker Yana Tallon-Hicks. Yana Tallon-Hicks, LMFT, is a sex therapist specializing in LGBTQ+ kinky and non-monogamous relationships, and is also the author of Hot and Unbothered, How to Think About, Talk About, and Have the Sex You Really Want. She is also a consent, sex, and sexuality columnist and educator. Whether written or with clients, her work centers around the belief that pleasure-positive and consent-based sex education can positively impact our lives and the world. She lives in Western Massachusetts, and you can find out more about her at yanatallonhicks.com. So for the next 20 minutes, we're going to be talking to Yana, and she is also a speaker at the Desire Summit. We'll be talking about Navigating Mismatched Desire, along with Nicoletta Heidegger. Make sure you hit subscribe wherever you're watching this so you don't miss out on any of our upcoming interviews. So Yana, before I get to your current work, I want to go back a little to your childhood and growing up. What did you learn about sex, whether at home or in school, and how have your views about sex and sexuality changed over time?
I mean, thankfully, my views on sex have changed a lot since childhood. I think that I don't really remember having comprehensive sex ed almost at all. Sometimes I wonder if this is because I switched schools, like kind of around the time people start sex ed in the States, like upper middle school. But mostly I feel like anything I did get was very fear-based, right? It's very much like avoid STIs at all costs, like avoid pregnancy at all costs. Certainly none of it was about pleasure-based sexuality. My parents are very supportive of my career. And so now they both like to really take credit for my progressive viewpoints and the things that I do. But I do remember them kind of like trapping me in a moving car to talk to me about the risks associated with sexuality and being like, oh my God, we still have 20 minutes until we get home. I can't believe I have to talk about this for 20 minutes. But I had a great experience at a very progressive summer camp where older, like, people in their 20s were teaching older teenagers sex education classes. So that felt very like peer-to-peer based and a little more like relevant to my life. And so I feel like that was really eye-opening for me. And since then, you know, it's been kind of a downhill slide or an uphill slide, depending on how you look at it.
That sounds unusual. I mean, yeah. a lot of people don't get any sex education or fear-based or only, you know, abstinence. Mm-hmm. So I want to know what led you into the sexuality field, but also piggybacking off what you just said, how did you kind of educate yourself?
Yeah, I think those kind of go like hand in hand where like there is sort of this one piece of this is that I was 14 or 15 years old when I was kind of beginning to think about sex and sexuality. It was the early 2000s. I didn't really have access to like even Google. And I was really curious about why it seemed like sex and sexuality was something that everyone seemed very interested in and kind of like titillated about, but also nobody seemed to know like what it was or how to really get the kind of sex that they actually wanted. And then I kind of really wanted to figure it out. And I do live in a pretty progressive area. So we have this clinic that is called Tapestry Health here, which is sort of like our local version of Planned Parenthood. And they give everybody access to affordable testing and safer sex supplies and conversations about sex and sexuality and sexual health. So I kind of was pursuing that on my own because I knew that it was important for me to understand how to keep myself safe and healthy. And so I feel like I kind of tried to figure it out on my own that way. And then my friends and I actually would talk about our experiences with sex and sexuality in high school quite a bit. And I don't know if that's unique now. I think like conversations about sex and sexuality are a lot more common. Sorry, that's my dog's very long nails and his high heels. But yeah, I think it's a little more common now, a little more easy to access. So I feel like it kind of was a combination of like, what is it called? Where it's like necessity spurns invention or whatever, you know, where it's like I kind of had to figure it out.
And so you're very active, especially on Instagram, giving sex ed information and sexuality posts and topics and videos and written text, and you write a sex column, and you've also written your book. I'm curious, what are the most common questions you get asked about sex, and has that changed over the time you've been working in this field? Like, are there newer subjects that people want to know about now that they didn't necessarily, or that weren't as popular 10 years ago?
Yeah. So I've been writing the sex advice column for over 10 years. And so over time, I mean, I think over time, first of all, my writing style has really changed and what people want out of sex advice has really changed. I feel like in the earlier days of sort of like, you know, the ask whoever columns, it was kind of more like salacious, where someone would be like, oh my God, anal sex, like he. And since like we've progressed from there, I think people are a little more earnest about what they're asking. Because I think more sex acts are becoming less taboo and things are becoming more relationally complicated, right? So instead of saying like, is it okay that I want to do this sort of like taboo sex act, people are more so thinking about like, where does my desire to do this come from? How do I talk to my partner about it? How do I navigate sort of that like relational aspect? I also get a lot of people wondering if they're like bad, weird, or broken for a variety of reasons. And it's kind of like, and I talk about this in the book, where we're kind of stuck in this damned if you do, damned if you don't place, where people feel like they're bad, weird, or broken if they have a high libido, if they have a low libido, if they're into a kinky thing, if they're not into a kinky thing, if they're monogamous, if they're not monogamous. Like, kind of no matter where you turn, people are worried that they are sort of like the only one or something is wrong because of what they desire. So that's hard because I feel like we're getting in this space where sex positivity is really like booming, right? Like Tinder basically came on the scene and suddenly being like dating around and being sort of like slutty and hookup culture became very more accepted, which I think is amazing. And now we're getting to this point where I hear a lot of people being like, I'm kind of tired of things being so sex saturated. Like, is it okay that I don't want to do this thing? So I feel like, you know, we're pack animals. We want to be accepted by our people. And so I think it is normal to feel worried that you're not fitting into some sort of desire template, but everyone is really different. And I know that's kind of like a canned response, but it's super true. And I think that having the skill set to talk about those differences is really where people come in and do a lot of work.
That's really interesting. And when you mentioned that center that's near you, that's the Tapestry, did you say?
Yeah, Tapestry Health.
So I imagine that not every city has something like that. How can someone find something like that in person, and what resources are there online? Like, where can people find, you know, people like you or people like you? Like, where can people go to get legitimate sex ed information that isn't, I don't know if predatory is the right word, but isn't false, like isn't damaging to them, or that is open and minded and is accepting of their questions?
Yeah, I think part of this is catered to the individual, right? So some people will have experiences being raised in purity culture, and they might want to work with somebody who is that's like their niche, right? There's a virtual colleague of mine, Erica Smith Sex Ed, who does purity culture based repair in sex education, right? So that's very niche. Other clients of mine might not feel like they resonate with that at all, and they want to learn more about kink and queer sexuality. That's going to be a different kind of avenue. So I think some of this stuff is about like the literacy, like you're saying, like where do you go and how do you know where to go? If you're looking for one-on-one care, ASECT is a pretty popular website of sexuality professionals who have gone through the AASECT specific training. You won't find everybody on there. I don't think I'm on there. There's also poly-aware professionals and kink-aware professionals, which are both specific listservs of professionals that are competent in those areas. And so on those sites, you can find like doctors, therapists, occupational therapists, like whatever. And I think a lot of this is about building community. So I think when people are working in isolation, like me in the early 2000s, I happen to know that this place existed through, I don't even know, maybe the grapevine or my health center at school or something. But I think now the nice thing about everything being so internet is that you have more opportunity to build community and get concrete recommendations that are actually helpful. And I think the drawback is that when you are like a young person just kind of like Googling, you might find things that don't necessarily feel reputable. For myself and even for adult clients, I like to use Scarletine, which is actually targeted for teenagers. It's sex education for teens. But I think that their stuff is really clear and super comprehensive, and that site's been built for years. So they have tons of stuff. But yeah, I think it is important not to just like Google, like, you know, is it bad that I like this? Because you're just going to find so much stuff to confirm your biases anyway, and that might not necessarily be helpful.
That makes sense. I want to give our listeners just those URLs. AASECT is the American Association of Sexuality Educators. That website is aasect.org. Kink and Polyamory Aware Professionals is kapprofessionals.org. And Scarletine, Sex Education for the Real World, is Scarlet, SCARLETEEN.com. So I want to talk about your book, Hot and Bothered, How to Think About, Talk About, and Have the Sex You Really Want, which came out last year. Can you tell a little bit more about what inspired you to write it, what's in the book, and who your target audience is?
Yeah. I mean, I feel like my life just sort of inspired me to write it. Like, I think I always knew that I was going to write this book. It was just sort of a matter of when. And what was your second question?
Oh, what inspired you to write it, and who's your target audience, and just a little more about what's in the book?
Yeah. So I think my target audience is sort of the same audience that I've been writing the column for, which I feel like is sort of like everybody from like 16 to 75, which also reflects my client base. And I feel like they're people who sort of like, they have a general understanding that like, consent is a good idea and like sex positivity is a thing, right? There's kind of these like base level understandings, but they really want to learn how to build these concepts into their actual sex lives. So the flow of the book really follows the flow of how I work with clients. So the beginning is sort of looking at like this kind of cultural context that we're raised in that is largely sex negative and fear-based. The second part of the book kind of moves into identifying common barriers to like positive sexuality and pleasure, such as like the classic mood or pleasure pessimism is what I call it, sexual imposter syndrome, things like that. And then the third and fourth parts of the book are navigating how to move those barriers out of your own sex life and build more pleasure for yourself. And then the last part of the book is really like concrete troubleshooting. So that's where we get into like navigating desire discrepancies and kind of building these concepts in a way that feels sustainable. And you, do you want me to answer this question?
Well, yes. I realized my mind sometimes takes a minute to catch up. You were talking about your column earlier.
Yeah.
Where can people follow your column?
Yeah, so my column is on valleyadvocate.com. Some of them are on my website, but I've kind of slacked on uploading those, to be honest. And I will post them on my Instagram sometimes too. But if you want all of them, valleyadvocate.com.
Okay. So you're speaking at the Desire Summit February 11th about navigating mismatched desire. And that was the topic you suggested. And I wanted to know if you can tell us more about kind of what that might look like in a relationship. And obviously you're going to speak more extensively about that. But in general, are there any tips people can glean about where to start with that? Because I think especially that's something people might not have at the beginning of their relationship that might change over time. especially in a long-term relationship, one person's interests, whether the amount of sex they want or the type of sex they want, might change, and the other person or people's that might change too, or one might stay the same and others might change. And so how does that play out in relationships, and how can people navigate that without it disrupting the relationship? Because my sense is that often people will feel like, oh, you're rejecting me, or it's a personal slight versus like an inner change in the person.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I think like what you're saying is correct, right? That like in the beginning of relationships, we kind of have this like new chemical kind of fueled thing where it's like, oh my God, we have all this stuff in common and like we're so into each other and like we'll move mountains to hang out and we're so special and like nothing will ever get in our way. That is a totally common relationship phase. It's called the symbiotic phase, according to Ellen Bader and Peter Pearson, which I talk about in the book, and plan to talk about at the summit. And in this symbiotic phase, we're like very good at either consciously or subconsciously paring away things that make us different because we want to bond with this person that we're really into. And then as we kind of move through that phase, which can last like 6-ish months or so, we start realizing that like, oh, we do have differences. And this could be differences in like hobbies, the way we spend our time, what we like, or it could also be differences in sex and sexuality and what we desire. And so when I think about desire differences, I think about a few different things. So one is like, what type of sex do you want to have, right? Like, what acts do you enjoy? What kind of like flavor of sexuality do you like? And then the other type of difference I see a lot is libido mismatch, right? So I love to have sex like 5 days a week and my partner wants to have sex once a month. How do we navigate that? And so when I see clients, which I do see clients a lot dealing with these issues, like part of the question is like, do you want to work towards obliterating this difference? Or do you want to work towards coping with this difference and sort of folding this difference into your life as a part of your relationship? And I think there's a lot of things that aren't necessarily like one size fits all that go into this issue. So sometimes, especially with libido, like understanding what libido is and how it works differently for different people. So Emily Nagoski talks a lot in her book about responsive versus spontaneous desire, which we plan to talk about at the summit a little bit. So understanding how your libido works, right? Like what actually kicks that on for you and what doesn't. And also understanding what you do and don't want to change. So some people are asexual. That's just their part of their life and their identity. They don't want to change it. And so like, how do you handle the fact that you might have different identities? Some people have low libidos, but they really want to have a higher libido and they totally want to change it. That's a different kind of work. So I think the first part is understanding what's going on. And I think for a lot of people, like you're not going to want to have sex that isn't appealing to you. So like, are you having sex that's appealing, right? That's a big question. And in the book, there's a very extensive yes, no, maybe list that can help sort of like kickstart that conversation. So I don't think like a desire difference is necessarily one thing. And so one solution isn't going to fit everybody, but I do think talking about it and acknowledging it is always, always, always the first step. And I think that can take people a long time to acknowledge because they feel like something's wrong because they're not spontaneously wanting to like rip each other's clothes off all the time. But that's very normal.
Well, as you were talking, I was thinking about a situation in my personal life, which is not exactly the same as one person wanting to have sex more often, but about the time we have sex. Because for me, like just my general energy for life is in the morning. Like I usually wake up 5 or 6. So by like 9 o'clock, I'm just not, I don't have a lot of energy for anything, but certainly for sex. And like sometimes my partner does. And it's not necessarily a source of tension, but it's definitely a difference because like if he's sleeping till 7 and I'm getting up at 5, I think like, and sometimes it's not that I don't want it, but like literally I'm just tired and like, and sometimes I'm not, like it's different every day, but I think there's a lot of situations where this could apply. So I want to know, what are you working on now or next? And also where can people follow you and find out more about you?
Yeah. Right now I am working on keeping up with my caseload of clients. which has been a lot, which is great, but it's a lot. And when I'm not doing that, I've been working on a second book proposal. I'm writing a book that's more geared towards sort of designer relationships and creating relationship structures kind of outside of the norms of monogamy and non-monogamy that we've been set up to look at. And yeah, otherwise I'm like parenting and like doing my yoga and like reading a bunch of books. If you want to keep up with me, my website is yanatallonhicks.com. That's where you can find all the ways to work with me as a client, as a coach, doing professional consultations, or hire me to speak or do a workshop. And socially, I'm mostly on Instagram at _VSpot. And that's where I post informational carousels a lot and also just random life things.
Thank you so much. Please come hear Yana speak with Nicoletta Heidegger about Navigating Mismatched Desire on February 11th at the Desire Summit. You can get tickets and find out more at summit.residence11.com. And a reminder that it's happening live in Los Angeles and will also be live streamed so you can watch it from anywhere. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.